welcome to the deep dive. So you shared Gina Moffa's book, Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, and that's exactly what we're going to tackle today, really dig into the complexities of grief.
Yeah.
Our mission basically is to pull out the key ideas from her, nearly 20 years as a psychotherapist, and help understand, all the different sides of this really personal experience.
It's so important right off the bat to acknowledge that grief isn't just about, say, losing a loved one. It can be any big life change, really.
No.
Losing a job, a relationship ending, maybe even letting go of a dream you had. And it hits everyone so, so differently.
Absolutely. And I think to really get Moffa's view, it helps to know where she's coming from. She's been, like you said, almost 2 decades with people going through incredibly tough stuff.
Yeah.
Places like Mount Sinai, 92NY here in New York. That kind of experience, it must really shape her understanding.
Oh, definitely. What really comes through is that she's been in the trenches, working with so many different people, different kinds of loss. It gives her this really strong sense that grief is way more than just an emotion.
Okay.
It's a full-on, full-body thing, hits you mentally, physically, emotionally. And she just jumps right in, challenging that idea that grief is neat or linear or that you just, move on.
Okay, let's get into that full body experience then.
Yeah.
She talks about something called the grief fall right at the start. It came from her own life, losing her mother suddenly. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that tell us about grief?
Yeah, the grief fall. It's such a powerful term. She describes it as this feeling like the floor just completely vanished from under her. It wasn't just sadness. It was total disorientation, like being completely adrift.
Wow.
And that feeling, that grief fall, it really underscores how unpredictable grief is, how nonlinear. It doesn't stick to a schedule, no clear beginning, middle, end. You just don't know when feelings or memories are going to pop up.
That really resonates, doesn't it? You might think you're doing okay, managing things, and then bam, a huge wave just hits you out of the blue. Moffa really hammers home that it's this full-on, full-body experience, like you said, on a spectrum. What affects where you might be on that spectrum?
It's incredibly changeable. So many things can influence it day to day. How tired you are, for instance. Specific triggers, maybe a song, a smell, a time of year.
Anniversaries.
Anniversaries, exactly. Even just your emotional state that day before anything happens. Knowing it varies so much is key. If we expect grief to be this straight line, we end up judging ourselves when it's not,
Yeah, or dismissing it. So then Moffa gets into this thing she calls sparkle-covered sadness and emotional bypassing. She uses an example, a client, Sam.
Right.
What was going on there, and why is trying to dodge the pain actually unhelpful?
Right, Sam. His situation was really interesting because he presented as totally fine, even though he'd lost his mother and his yoga studio. Huge losses, right?
Yeah.
And he was using his spiritual practice, Kundalini meditation, almost like a way to leap over the pain, looking for a quick spiritual answer or fix. That's what Moffa means by emotional bypassing, trying to avoid or minimize those difficult feelings.
But the pain doesn't actually vanish, does it? It just gets sort of buried.
Exactly. Trying to sidestep those raw emotions might feel better for a moment, but it stops the real processing, the healing that needs to happen. Moffa is clear. Spiritual practices can absolutely support you in your grief. But they can't be a substitute for doing that emotional work. And there's often this societal pressure, especially here in the West, to just bounce back quickly that really gets in the way of grieving authentically.
Okay. She then talks about types of loss that maybe don't always get the attention they deserve. Let's start with anticipatory grief. What's that about?
Anticipatory grief is basically grieving before a loss actually happens. So maybe a loved one has a terminal illness or, big layoff is coming at work.
Right, you see it coming.
Yeah. Even though the final event hasn't occurred, your mind and body can actually start the grieving process, that feeling of any day now. Recognizing it is important because it lets you be kinder to yourself. Understand you might already be carrying that grief weight even before the loss itself.
And it doesn't mean you won't grieve later, too, I imagine.
Oh, absolutely not. It often comes back just in its own time.
Okay. And another one she brings up, which might not always feel like grief, is ambiguous loss. What defines that?
Ambiguous loss is tricky because there's no clear closure. You don't always know exactly what's been lost. Moffa uses the example of a friendship that just fades out.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
It really is. There's no big blow up maybe, but that closeness is just gone. And she points out, interestingly, that losing a close friend can sometimes feel even harder than a romantic breakup because of that deep emotional intimacy. But society often doesn't really acknowledge friendship loss as significant grief.
Which leads right into the next idea.
Yeah.
Disenfranchised grief. What's that, and why is it harmful?
Disenfranchised grief is any grief that isn't really acknowledged or validated by the people around you, or by society in general. It could be grieving an ex-partner, maybe a colleague you weren't super close to but whose death still hits you, a public figure.
Or maybe a loss you feel you can't talk about openly.
Exactly. The core problem is that this lack of acceptance, it causes real psychological harm because it tells you your experience isn't valid. It dismisses a basic human feeling. So it's crucial for anyone feeling this way to hear. Your loss is real, your pain is valid, no matter what anyone else says or thinks.
Moffa also talks about how one loss can kind of trigger others' secondary losses, and then this idea of cumulative loss. Can you explain those?
Sure. Secondary losses are like the domino effect. One big loss knocks over other things, like a divorce isn't just the end of the marriage. It might mean losing shared friends, changing routines, maybe even losing your sense of identity in some
Like the
ways.
ripples.
Exactly. And cumulative loss is when you experience multiple losses close together. It just feels overwhelming. Moffa tells the story of her client, Shira, who lost her grandmother during the pandemic,
Uh-huh.
but on top of that, couldn't have the usual cultural mourning rituals because of COVID restrictions, plus other life stresses piling up. It shows how losses can just stack up and make everything feel heavier.
Okay, now here's something that might sound a bit counterintuitive after talking so much about acknowledging grief. Moffa mentions permission not to grieve right away. What's she getting at there?
Yeah, it's a really important nuance. She acknowledges that right after a loss, sometimes, well, practical stuff just takes over. You might be swamped with arrangements, legal things, caring for others,
We're just exhausted.
or just totally exhausted
Yeah.
physically and emotionally, or maybe you just don't feel safe enough yet to really let the feelings in. Giving yourself permission not to grieve immediately is about recognizing those realities without piling on guilt. The grief will come when it's ready, when you have the space or safety for it.
And then the flip side of allowing yourself to feel is this potential trap of self-gaslighting during grief. What is that exactly?
Self-gaslighting in grief, it's when you start doubting your own feelings, questioning if you should be feeling this way, or if your grief is too much or not enough. Moffa uses the example of her client, Liv.
Mm.
Liv had sort of absorbed her mother's judgments about showing sadness, so she felt like she shouldn't be grieving so deeply. This internal voice dismissing your own pain. It's really damaging because it stops you from being honest with yourself and actually processing the grief. Noticing that self-doubt, that internal critic, is the first step to challenging it.
We've talked a lot about the emotional side, the mental side, but Moffa is emphatic. Grief is a full-body experience. How does it actually show up physically? And what's the link to our nervous system?
This is huge. It's not just in your head. Grief has real, tangible physical symptoms. Moffa lists things like sleep changes, sleeping way too much or not at all, appetite changes, aches and pains you can't explain, stomach problems, headaches,
Wow, a whole range.
a whole range. And there's actually growing science behind this psychoneuroimmunology, it's called. Basically, the connection between your mind, your nervous system, and your immune system. It shows how deeply loss affects your whole physical being, potentially even increasing risks for chronic health stuff down the line,
Okay.
and our nervous system is right in the thick of it. Grief, like trauma, can trigger those stress responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, trying to cope. She gives examples. One client felt intense anger, that's fight. Another felt totally numb, frozen. Someone else just wanted to run away, keep busy, flee from it all.
So if our nervous system gets so activated, what can we actually do? What strategies does Moffa suggest for, like, calming things down, self-regulation?
Yeah, she really focuses on tuning into your body and gives practical tools. Grounding exercises are great for this, like the 5-4-3-2-1 technique.
Right. Notice things you can see, feel,
Yeah.
hear.
Exactly. See, feel, hear, smell, taste. It pulls you back into the present moment. Also, mindfulness, things like deep breathing, body scan meditations, they help build awareness and calm that activated system. And she also talks about the container strategy.
A container.
Yeah, it's a mental tool. You visualize a container, a box, vault, whatever works for you, and you mentally place overwhelming thoughts or feelings inside it temporarily, just until you feel a bit stronger or have support to deal with them. It's about managing the intensity, not avoiding it forever.
That sounds useful. Another really interesting idea she introduces is grief rhythms.
Hmm.
What are those? Why is it helpful to recognize them?
Grief rhythms are basically our coping styles when we're grieving. Moffa sees them as protectors, our mind's way of shielding us when the pain feels like too much. She describes a few common ones.
Right.
There's the survivor, who's hyper-focused on practical needs, just getting through. The mover, who keeps busy, 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 internalizing feelings. The compartmentalizer, who puts feelings in boxes to function day to day. Then the intellectualizer, needing to understand, gather information about grief. The rumination, getting stuck in those what-ifs, trying to find control. And the emotional avoidance bypasser, maybe using those spiritual cliches or forced positivity we talked about.
Right.
The big message here is there's no wrong rhythm. They're coping mechanisms, and you might shift between them. Just recognizing your go-to rhythm helps you understand yourself without judgment.
Self-compassion seems really key here. And throughout her whole approach, how does that apply when we get caught in what she calls the death digression?
Self-compassion is absolutely central. Treat yourself like you'd treat a dear friend going through this with kindness, patience, understanding. The death digression. That's when you get stuck replaying past moments, regrets, guilt about things you said or didn't say to the person who died.
Oh yeah, I can see how that happens.
Totally. You can lose sight of the whole relationship, focusing only on those painful bits. And if there were unmet needs in that relationship already, it can really magnify the pain, make you question your own worth. Moffa shares a really lovely personal example, creating interstellar mother-daughter time in her mind to keep that connection alive and push back against regret.
Grief can feel just crushing sometimes,
Yeah.
like too much. Does Moffa talk about when that weight might mean it's time to seek professional help?
Yes, she definitely acknowledges that feeling of it being too much to bear, and she stresses it's okay and often really necessary to get support. She includes the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline number 988 as a vital resource if thoughts go there.
Important.
Absolutely. She talks about grief overload, using her client Hiroko as an example. Hiroko became depressed while grieving her mother from afar, separated geographically from family support. The signal is really when the grief feels constant, debilitating, and it's seriously impacting your ability to function day to day. There's zero shame in getting professional mental health support then.
Okay. Something else grieving people often face are those well-meaning platitudes, they're in a better place, things like that. Why does Moffa find these so problematic?
Oh, the platitudes. Yeah. Things like they're in a better place, or God needed another angel, or time heals all wounds. They usually come from the other person's discomfort,
Yeah,
right?
they don't know what else to say.
Exactly. They want to fix it or make the awkwardness go away. But Moffa points out these phrases often feel really invalidating to the person grieving. They can minimize the pain, shut down conversation, make the person feel even more alone. Authenticity, just being present, patience, compassion, that's so much more helpful than canned phrases. She mentions a client, Kirsten, who specifically asked people not to use platitudes after her miscarriage, but instead share stories or just offer support.
That takes courage. Okay, so grief can feel isolating, but sometimes you might also really crave solitude. How do you navigate that push-pull between needing space and needing connection?
Moffa says it's totally normal for that need to swing back and forth. Both solitude and community are important forms of self-care in grief. A supportive network can be amazing comfort, practical help, just knowing people care.
Uh-huh.
But you also need time alone to rest, to process without having to perform for anyone, just to be with your grief. She shares a really moving story about her friends showing up for her at her mother's funeral, the power of that connection. But she's also realistic. Sometimes grief changes friendships. Some people just can't show up in the ways you need.
Yeah, that can be another layer of loss, can it? What about making plans, managing expectations? That feels impossible sometimes when you're grieving.
It really can. Her advice is about trusting yourself and being realistic about your energy and emotional capacity. She suggests having plans A, B, and C for potentially tricky situations, like a social event.
Okay, like what?
So plan A might be, I'll go and stay the whole time. Plan B, I'll go, but only stay for an hour, check in with myself. And plan C, you know what? Today's not the day. I'm not going. It gives you flexibility and permission to respect your limits. She reminds us grief can shrink our window of tolerance for stress and social stuff for a while. So being gentle is key.
Family dynamics. Those can get extra complicated with the grief too, right? Any insights there?
Oh, definitely. Families often have unspoken rules about emotions, long histories. Grief can stir all that up. Moffa encourages tuning into your own feelings within those dynamics and communicating your needs if it feels safe and possible. But sometimes, she suggests, acceptance is also needed, accepting that family members might have limitations in how they can support you, and finding support elsewhere if needed.
And what about relationships? Dating, long-term partnerships? How does grief affect those?
When it comes to dating while actively, intensely grieving, her advice is pretty cautious. Basically, if you're feeling really raw and fragile, maybe hold off. You're more vulnerable to getting hurt further.
Makes sense.
In long-term relationships, grief inevitably shifts things. Open communication is vital. There might be imbalances in support for a while. She offers good questions to ask yourself and your partner about what you each need as you navigate grief together. It changes the landscape.
She really emphasizes radical truth-telling and asking for support. What does that mean practically?
Radical truth-telling starts with being honest with yourself first. Really acknowledging how you feel, the good, the bad, the messy. Then it's about finding ways to express that honestly when needed. She gives examples of how to answer, "How are you?" beyond just "fine."
Yeah, that's always a hard one.
Right. And clearly asking for what you need, like, "Could you just sit with me?" or "I need help with errands this week." It's about asserting your right to prioritize your grieving process and setting boundaries to protect it.
Social media.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
How does that fit into grieving today, according to Moffa?
It's a mixed bag, isn't it? She sees the complexity. On one hand, it can be a place for connection, finding support groups, sharing tributes, but it can also be performative. You might feel pressure to present your grief in a certain way, or you see others' seemingly perfect grief journeys and feel isolated or compare yourself. Her advice is check in with yourself before you post something vulnerable. Ask why you're sharing it. And definitely protect your boundaries online. You don't owe anyone your story.
Okay, let's really hit the core message of the book's title. Moving on doesn't mean letting go. What's her take on that phrase, moving on, and what's a better way to think about it?
She really pushes back against moving on. It just doesn't feel right when you've deeply loved someone or something and then lost them. It implies leaving them behind.
Yeah.
Instead, she talks about continuing bonds, this idea that it's natural, healthy, and okay to maintain a connection with the person who died. In whatever way feels right for you. It's not about being stuck. It's about relationship.
Can you give examples of continuing bonds?
Sure. She mentions clients like Lauren, who imagines her late brother cheering her on. Another who sees her father as a guardian angel. It could be talking to them, carrying something of theirs, keeping traditions alive. The point is, the love doesn't end. Grief and love can coexist. You don't have to let go of the connection to move forward in your life.
That's a much gentler way to think about it. What about anniversaries, birthdays, those milestone dates? How do they fit in?
Those dates can definitely bring grief rushing back, sometimes with surprising intensity, emotionally, even physically. Moffa advises planning for some extra self-care around those times and being flexible. Don't force yourself to do things that feel wrong.
And rituals.
Yes. She encourages creating remembrance rituals, ways to consciously connect your grief to the present. These don't have to be formal or religious. They can be totally personal. Lighting a candle, visiting a special place, cooking their favorite meal, wearing something that reminds you of them. Whatever feels meaningful to you and honoring them.
Finally, she uses this really evocative metaphor, the old room and the new room, to talk about integrating grief. Can you explain that?
It's a great way to visualize it. The old room is life before the loss. Familiar, comfortable, maybe taken for granted. The new room is life after the loss. It feels different, maybe empty, disorienting at first.
Okay.
Integrating grief isn't about sealing off the old room and only living in the new one. It's more like learning to move between them. You carry important things from the old room, the love, the memories, the connection into the new room. Gradually start to furnish the new room, make it feel more like home, even though it's different. You learn to live in this new reality while still holding the past.
So integration is about holding both. Joy and sorrow, remembrance and hope.
Exactly. It's about finding a way for grief to become part of the fabric of your life, not something you have to constantly fight against or get over. It coexists with life moving forward.
As we wrap up, Moffa encourages a kind of personal check-in. What sorts of questions does she suggest we might ask ourselves about our own grief journey?
She invites a gentle reflection, like, where do you feel you are right now in your process? No judgment, just awareness. Can you be really honest with yourself and maybe with trusted others about all the feelings? Do you feel safe enough to let yourself really feel the grief, even the physical side of it? And are you getting better at noticing what you need and setting boundaries around that? Just gentle prompts for self-awareness.
So ultimately, what's the main takeaway Gina Moffa wants to leave us with as we navigate our own losses?
I think the core message is really one of deep reassurance and self-compassion. First, your grief is yours alone. There's no right or wrong way. It's unique.
Yeah.
And while grief marks an ending, it is absolutely not your ending. She encourages acknowledging your own strength and getting through this incredibly hard stuff and focusing on finding meaningful connection to yourself, to life as it continues, to others, even while carrying the pain.
That's a powerful thought. That connection is still possible, even in sorrow. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We really hope these insights from Gina Moffa offer some comfort, maybe some understanding, and perhaps a bit more peace on your own path through grief.